The briefing room at RAF Scampton fell silent when Wing Commander Graham Sutherland pulled back the curtain covering the large wall map. 200 pairs of eyes stared at the red ribbon stretching from eastern England across the North Sea, over Holland, and deep into Germany. The ribbon ended at a city marked with a circle. Cologne. "Gentlemen," Sutherland said, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed room, "tonight you will be part of history. Operation Millennium. 1,000 bombers. One target. One night." The announcement was met with stunned silence, then a ripple of murmurs that grew into excited chatter. Flight Lieutenant Robert "Robbie" Harrison, pilot of Lancaster bomber S for Sugar, exchanged glances with his navigator, Flying Officer David Price. 1,000 bombers. Never before had such a force been assembled. Never before had anyone attempted to put that many aircraft over a single target in one night. It was May 30th, 1942, and RAF Bomber Command was gambling everything on a single audacious strike designed to prove that strategic bombing could win the war. Air Marshal Arthur "Bomber" Harris had scraped together every serviceable aircraft in England, frontline squadrons, training units, even obsolete types that should have been retired. Lancasters, Halifaxes, Stirlings, Wellingtons, Hamptons, even old Whitleys, anything that could carry bombs to Germany. "The raid will proceed in 3 waves, Sutherland continued, using a pointer to indicate the route on the map. Wave 1 consists of Stirlings and Halifaxes carrying incendiaries to mark the target and start fires. Wave 2, our Lancasters, will drop high-explosive bombs on those fires. Wave 3 will finish with a mixture of high-explosive and incendiaries. Total bomb load, 1,500 tons. The entire raid must be completed in 90 minutes to maximize concentration and overwhelm German defenses." Robbie studied the map, calculating distances, fuel requirements, timing. Cologne was nearly 500 miles from their base, 3 hours of flying each way, 6 hours total in the air, most of it over enemy territory, with thousands of anti-aircraft guns and hundreds of German night fighters trying to kill them. "Intelligence estimates approximately 200 flak guns defending Cologne," Sutherland went on, his tone matter-of-fact, "plus night fighter airfields at Venlo, Düsseldorf and Bonn. The Luftwaffe will throw everything they have at us. Expect heavy resistance." Beside Robbie, his bomb aimer, Sergeant Tommy Fletcher, a 20-year-old from Manchester, shifted nervously in his seat. This would be Fletcher's 10th mission, and he still looked terrified before every takeoff. Some men never got used to it, never conquered the fear. They just learned to function despite it. "Takeoff begins at 2230 hours, Sutherland concluded. "Weather over the target is forecast clear with good visibility. We expect a full moon, which will help navigation, but also make us more visible to fighters. Questions?" A hand went up in the back. "Sir, with that many aircraft in the air at once, how do we avoid collisions?" "Carefully," Sutherland said with grim humour. "Each squadron has been assigned specific altitudes and timing windows. Stick to your assigned height and stay alert. The biggest danger tonight may not be the Germans. It's running into each other in the dark." After the briefing, Robbie and his crew gathered in the dispersal hut to prepare their equipment. There were 7 men in his crew, himself as pilot, David Price as navigator, Tommy Fletcher as bomb aimer, Flight Sergeant Jack Morrison as flight engineer, Sergeant Willie Banks as wireless operator, and Sergeants Peter Walsh and Colin Drake as gunners in the rear and mid-upper turrets. They had flown together for 9 months, completing 23 missions. Each man knew the other's habits, strengths, and weaknesses. They had seen aircraft go down in flames, had lost friends to fighters and flak, had returned with their Lancaster shot full of holes. They were no longer the eager, naive boys who had joined up thinking war was adventure and glory. Now they knew better. War was survival, measured one mission at a time. 1,000 bombers, Morrison said, checking his flight engineer's panel one more time. That's insane. The Germans will see us coming from 50 miles away. That's rather the point, David Price replied, folding his navigation charts. We want them to see us. We want them to panic. Harris wants to prove we can destroy a German city in a single night. And all we have to do is not die in the process, Willie Banks added dryly, adjusting his radio equipment. At 2200 hours they boarded S for sugar, climbing through the rear door and taking their positions. Robbie settled into the pilot's seat on the left side of the cockpit, Morrison beside him at the flight engineer's panel. The Lancaster's 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines had already been warmed up by the ground crew. Robbie went through his pre-flight checks methodically: magnetos, fuel pressure, hydraulics, control surfaces, instruments. Everything had to be perfect. One mechanical failure over Germany could be fatal. Around them, across the airfield, dozens of other Lancasters were preparing for takeoff. Robbie could see crews climbing aboard, ground crews removing chocks, aircraft engines coughing to life. The night air filled with the thunder of 4-engine bombers coming alive. S for sugar, you are cleared for takeoff, the control tower radioed. Wind is from the west at 10 knots. Good luck. Roger, control, rolling now. Robbie released the brakes and advanced the throttles. The Lancaster, heavy with fuel and 10,000 pounds of bombs, began moving slowly down the runway. The tail wheel lifted off the ground as speed built. 60 miles per hour, 70, 80. The vibration of the wheels on concrete suddenly ceased as S for sugar lifted smoothly into the night sky. They climbed steadily, joining a circuit pattern with dozens of other bombers, forming up into the bomber stream. Robbie looked out his side window and felt his breath catch. Aircraft everywhere, above, below, to both sides, all climbing, all heading east. Red and green navigation lights winked in the darkness. The sky was full of bombers, more aircraft than he had ever seen in one place. Jesus, Morrison whispered, staring out at the spectacle. There really are 1,000 of them. They crossed the English coast at 8,000 feet, leaving the safety of home behind and heading out over the dark waters of the North Sea. Below they could see the white caps of waves reflecting moonlight. Above, stars wheeled in their ancient patterns, indifferent to human conflict playing out below. Navigator to pilot, David's voice came through the intercom. Turn to heading 095. Next waypoint in 42 minutes. Roger. Turning to 095. The bomber stream droned eastward through the night, a vast aerial armada carrying death and destruction toward Germany. Inside each aircraft, young men sat at their stations, some praying, some joking to hide their fear, some silent and withdrawn, all wondering if they would see another sunrise. Hundreds of miles away, in Cologne, Germany, 18-year-old Greta Hoffmann was getting ready for bed when the first air raid sirens began to wail. She paused, hairbrush in hand, listening to the rising and falling tone that every German civilian had learned to dread. Another raid. They had become routine lately, almost nightly visits from RAF bombers that dropped their loads and disappeared back into darkness. "Greta! Cellar! Now!" her mother called from downstairs. Greta grabbed her emergency bag, clothes, documents, a few precious photographs, and hurried downstairs. Her mother was already shepherding Greta's younger siblings, 9-year-old Hans and 12-year-old Elsa, toward the cellar door. Her father, too old for military service, was helping their elderly neighbour, Frau Weber, down the steep steps. The cellar was damp and cold, reinforced with wooden beams and sandbags. Oil lamps cast flickering shadows on the walls. A dozen neighbours had already gathered, families clustering together, children crying, adults trying to maintain calm despite the fear visible in their eyes. "How bad will it be tonight?" Frau Weber asked, her voice trembling. "They're just trying to scare us," Greta's father said with false confidence. "A few bombs, some fires, then they'll leave like always. We've survived every raid so far. We'll survive this one too." But 15 minutes later, when the first bombs began falling, everyone knew this night was different. The explosions weren't scattered or random. They came in waves, one after another, a rolling thunder that shook the cellar and brought dust raining down from the ceiling. The oil lamps swayed on their hooks. Children screamed. Adults clutched each other. Above the cellar, Cologne was beginning to burn. Robbie Harrison's Lancaster crossed the Dutch coast at 11:15 p.m, and immediately the sky ahead lit up with anti-aircraft fire. The Germans knew they were coming. How could they not? Nearly 1,000 aircraft droning through the night, visible in the bright moonlight, their engines audible for miles. "Flak ahead," Peter Walsh called from the rear turret. "Heavy concentrations. Looks like they're putting up everything they've got." Robbie could see it through the windscreen. Orange bursts of exploding shells creating a curtain of fire that the bomber stream had to penetrate. Each burst represented thousands of pieces of white-hot shrapnel expanding outward, lethal to anything in range. The German 88mm guns could reach 26,000 feet. The bombers flying at 15,000 to 20,000 feet were well within their envelope. "Pilot to crew, flak helmets on, stay sharp." They flew into the firestorm. Explosions erupted around them, some close enough that Robbie could feel the aircraft buffet from the concussion. Shrapnel pinged against the fuselage like deadly hail. To his left, a Wellington bomber took a direct hit, its fuel tanks exploding, the aircraft breaking apart in mid-air, burning pieces tumbling earthward. No parachutes. "Jesus Christ," Tommy Fletcher whispered from the bomb aimer's position in the nose. "There's so many of us. I can see dozens of planes everywhere I look." And he was right. The bomber stream filled the sky, wave after wave of aircraft converging on Cologne. The moonlight that made them vulnerable to fighters also allowed them to see each other, a vast aerial armada stretching for miles. Some bombers flew too close, their wingtips almost touching. Others drifted across flight paths, forcing evasive action. The coordination required to put this many aircraft over one target without massive collisions was staggering. "Navigator to pilot, 10 minutes to target," David Price called out. "Turn to heading 105. Robbie adjusted course, following the bomber stream toward the growing glow on the horizon. Cologne was already burning. The first wave of Sterlings and Halifaxes had arrived 20 minutes earlier, dropping thousands of incendiary bombs that had started hundreds of fires. Now those fires served as beacons, guiding the following waves directly to the target. "My God," Morrison breathed, staring at the inferno ahead. "The whole city is on fire." Cologne sprawled before them, a vast expanse of flames and smoke illuminated by the full moon. Individual fires had merged into massive conflagrations that created their own weather, sending columns of smoke thousands of feet into the air. The city looked like a vision of hell, orange and red flames consuming everything, smoke obscuring whole districts. "Bomb aimer to pilot. I have the target visual," Tommy called. "Beginning bombing run." "Roger. Bomb doors open." Robbie felt the aircraft slow slightly as the bomb bay doors swung open, exposing the 10,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs nestled in the fuselage. The Lancaster was now at its most vulnerable, flying straight and level, unable to take evasive action, committed to the bombing run regardless of flak or fighters. "Steady, steady." Tommy's voice was tense with concentration as he lined up the bomb sight. Left, left. Steady, hold it. All around them, other bombers were dropping their loads. Robbie could see bombs falling from aircraft above and below them, tumbling end over end toward the burning city. Each stick of bombs would create a line of explosions, each explosion adding to the devastation already wrought. In the cellar beneath Cologne, Greta Hoffmann clung to her mother as the building above them shook with each nearby explosion. The sounds were indescribable, a continuous roar of detonating bombs, collapsing buildings, and the strange rushing noise of fires consuming everything combustible. Dust filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The oil lamps had gone out, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the hellish orange glow seeping through cracks in the ceiling. "The house is burning!" someone screamed. "We have to get out!" "No!" Greta's father shouted. "Outside is worse. We stay here until the raid ends." But staying meant slowly suffocating as smoke seeped into the cellar. Leaving meant braving the inferno outside, where high-explosive bombs were still falling and buildings were collapsing. There were no good choices, only desperate calculations of which death was less likely. Young Hans was crying, his face buried in his mother's dress. Elsa sat rigid with shock, her eyes wide and unseeing. Frau Weber was praying, her lips moving silently, her rosary beads clicking in her shaking hands. Around them, 24 neighbours huddled together, strangers bound by shared terror. "Bombs away!" Tommy called out, and Robbie felt the Lancaster suddenly lighten as 5 tons of explosives dropped free. "Bomb doors closed. Let's get out of here." Robbie banked the Lancaster away from the target, turning northwest toward home. But as he did, he glimpsed something that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Through gaps in the smoke, he could see the streets of Cologne, could see fires consuming residential neighborhoods, could see tiny figures running through the streets, trying to escape the inferno. People, civilians, families like his own, trapped in a nightmare they hadn't asked for, dying because their government had started a war that was now consuming them. "Enemy fighters!" Colin Drake's voice exploded over the intercom. 9 o'clock high, coming in fast." Robbie's moment of reflection shattered. A Messerschmitt Bf-110 night fighter dove toward them from above, its nose lit up with cannon fire. Tracer rounds streaked past the cockpit, close enough that Robbie could see individual bullets. He threw the Lancaster into a diving turn, the heavy bomber responding sluggishly, its 4 engines screaming. Peter Walsh opened fire from the rear turret, his 4 303 machine guns chattering. Colin Drake in the mid-upper turret joined in. The Lancaster vibrated with the recoil. Spent shell casings clinked against the metal floor. The Bf-110 flashed past, its pilot pulling up to avoid colliding with them. But there were more fighters. The Luftwaffe had scrambled everything available, and now German night fighters were tearing into the bomber stream, picking off aircraft one by one. "Wellington going down, 3 o'clock, someone called. Robbie saw it. A twin-engine bomber spinning out of control, one wing shot away, trailing fire. It fell like a wounded bird, disappearing into the smoke below. 7 men aboard, maybe 8, dead or dying. Another one, 10 o'clock. It's a Halifax. The carnage was becoming visible now as the moon illuminated the sky, and the fires below provided additional light. Aircraft were going down everywhere, shot down by fighters, hit by flak, colliding with each other in the chaos. Parachutes blossomed here and there, white mushrooms against the darkness, but most aircraft simply fell burning, their crews trapped inside. "Bf-110 coming around for another pass," Peter warned. "Same one, I think." The German pilot was persistent, diving in again from a different angle. This time his aim was better. Robbie heard the distinctive sound of cannon shells hitting the aircraft, felt the Lancaster shudder as 20mm rounds tore through the fuselage. "We're hit!" Willie Banks shouted. "Starboard inner engine smoking!" Morrison was already working the problem, his hands flying over the engineer's panel. "Shutting down starboard inner, feathering prop, fire suppression activated." The engine's propeller slowed and stopped, its blades turning edge-on to reduce drag. The Lancaster could fly on 3 engines, but it would be slower, more vulnerable, and they still had nearly 3 hours of flying to reach England. The Bf-110 came in for a third attack, but this time Peter Walsh was ready. He led the fighter perfectly, his tracer rounds walking up toward the approaching aircraft. Hits sparkled along the Bf-110's fuselage and port engine. The German fighter broke off, trailing smoke, turning away. "Got him," Peter crowed. "I think I got him." "Save the celebration until we're home," Robbie said tersely, fighting to keep the crippled Lancaster under control. "David, give me a heading for base. Direct route, shortest distance." Heading 290. Distance 465 miles. Flight time approximately 3 hours 15 minutes on 3 engines. 3 hours and 15 minutes. Nearly 200 minutes of flying through hostile airspace with a damaged aircraft, dodging fighters and flak, hoping the remaining 3 engines kept running. The odds weren't good. Behind them, Cologne continued to burn. The 90-minute raid was reaching its crescendo as the third wave of bombers arrived to finish what the first 2 had started. Over 1,400 tons of bombs, 2/3 of them incendiaries, were falling on the city. Fires had started in over 2,500 locations, overwhelming the city's fire brigades. Entire neighborhoods were ablaze. The medieval city center, with its narrow streets and timber-framed buildings, was being consumed. In her cellar, Greta finally convinced her father that staying meant death by smoke inhalation. The building above them was burning, and the ceiling was beginning to sag under the weight of collapsing floors. They had to risk the journey outside. "Everyone, wet your coats and cover your mouths," Greta's father commanded. They soaked their clothing with the last of their water, then pushed open the cellar door. The world outside was unrecognizable. Their street, once lined with neat apartment buildings, cafes and shops, had been transformed into a hellscape. Every building was burning. The asphalt street had melted from the heat. Pieces of buildings, bricks, timbers, furniture, lay scattered everywhere. Bodies lay in the rubble, some intact, others torn apart by blast effects. The heat was intense, almost unbearable. The air was so hot it hurt to breathe. Sparks and embers swirled through the air like deadly snow. Above them, they could still hear the bombers, wave after wave, continuing to drop their loads. "This way," Greta's father shouted over the roar of the fires. "Toward the cathedral. The square is open ground." They ran through the burning streets, a family of 5 and a dozen neighbors, dodging falling debris, jumping over craters, trying not to look at the bodies. Young Hans stumbled and fell, and Greta scooped him up, carrying him despite the weight, driven by adrenaline and desperation. A building collapsed ahead of them, blocking their path with a mountain of burning rubble. They detoured down a side street, then another, quickly becoming disoriented in a city they no longer recognized. Everything was burning. Every landmark was destroyed. The smoke was so thick they could barely see 10 meters ahead. Then, through the smoke and flames, Greta saw something impossible. The twin spires of Cologne Cathedral, still standing, miraculously untouched by the inferno surrounding it. The massive Gothic structure rose above the devastation like a beacon of hope. "There!" she screamed, pointing. "The cathedral!" They staggered toward it, a desperate sprint through hell. Behind them, another wave of bombers passed overhead, their payload adding to the destruction. Ahead, the cathedral grew larger, its stone walls and soaring spires somehow surviving while everything around it burned. They reached the cathedral square and collapsed on the open ground, gasping for breath, their clothes smouldering, their faces blackened by soot. Around them, hundreds of other survivors had gathered, drawn to this one place that still stood, this one sanctuary in a city of fire. In the sky above, the last bombers of the third wave were turning for home, their bomb bays empty, their crews exhausted. The raid had lasted 93 minutes from first bomb to last. In that time, nearly 900 aircraft had dropped their loads on Cologne. The city would burn for days. Robbie Harrison's Lancaster limped across the Dutch coast on 3 engines at Euro 140 hours. They had made it out of German airspace, though not without cost. 2 of their crew were wounded. Willie Banks had taken shrapnel in the shoulder, and Colin Drake had been hit in the leg. The aircraft had over 50 holes in it from flak and cannon fire. The hydraulic system was damaged, which would make landing dangerous. But they were alive, and they were heading home. "Pilot to crew, we did it," Robbie said, his voice hoarse with exhaustion. "Well done, all of you. David, how many aircraft do you estimate were over the target?" "Hard to say accurately, but I counted at least 200 in sight at any given moment. If the operation went as planned, there were close to 900. 900 bombers, the largest aerial attack in history, and Cologne had borne the brunt of it." "How many do you think we lost?" Tommy asked quietly. No one answered, because they all knew the number would be staggering. They had seen dozens of aircraft go down. How many more had they not witnessed? How many crews, 7 men per bomber, had died tonight? The mathematics of war were brutal and unforgiving. They crossed the English coast at 02:45 hours and requested emergency landing clearance at the nearest airfield. The hydraulic failure made lowering the landing gear problematic, and they had to use the manual backup system, Morrison cranking the gear down by hand. The landing was rough, the damaged Lancaster touching down hard, bouncing once before settling on the runway. Fire trucks and ambulances raced alongside them as they rolled to a stop. Medical personnel helped Willie and Colin out, loading them onto stretchers. The rest of the crew climbed out on shaky legs, their flight suits soaked with sweat despite the cold night air. Ground crews swarmed over S for sugar, counting holes, assessing damage, shaking their heads at the punishment the aircraft had absorbed. The Lancaster had saved their lives tonight. Tomorrow, mechanics would patch her up and make her ready to do it all again. The debriefing took an hour. Intelligence officers wanted every detail. Time over target, bomb load dropped, accuracy, enemy defences, fighters encountered, aircraft seen going down. Robbie and his crew answered mechanically, too exhausted for emotion. "Preliminary reports indicate approximately 900 aircraft reached the target," the intelligence officer told them. "We're still receiving reports, but current estimates are 41 aircraft lost. That's less than 5% losses, far better than we anticipated." 41 aircraft, nearly 300 men dead or captured. Robbie thought about the families who would receive telegrams tomorrow, the wives who would become widows, the children who would grow up without fathers. He thought about the civilians in Cologne, the people he'd glimpsed running through burning streets. How many of them had died tonight? "What did we accomplish?" Robbie asked. "Was it worth it?" The intelligence officer looked at him sharply. "We dropped over 1,400 tons of bombs on a major German industrial city. Reconnaissance flights tomorrow will assess the damage, but initial reports from the last aircraft over the target suggest Cologne is essentially destroyed. We proved that Bomber Command can put 1,000 aircraft over a single target and devastate it in 90 minutes. That's what we accomplished, Flight Lieutenant." but as Robbie walked back to his quarters in the grey pre-dawn light, he wondered if that was really an answer. They had destroyed a city. They had killed German civilians. They had demonstrated that Britain could hit back, that the war was far from over. But had they shortened the war? Had they saved lives in the long run? Or had they simply added to the mountain of dead that this conflict was creating? He didn't know. He was just a pilot following orders, doing his duty, trying to survive one mission at a time. In Cologne, dawn revealed the full extent of the devastation. Over 13,000 buildings destroyed or severely damaged, industrial facilities wrecked, transportation networks crippled, gas, water and electrical systems offline, and 469 people dead, with thousands more injured and 45,000 homeless. Greta Hoffmann and her family spent the morning searching for relatives and friends. They found her aunt's family alive, but their home destroyed. Her father's business partner was dead, crushed when his building collapsed. Frau Weber's son, who lived across the city, was missing and would never be found. The city's residents emerged from cellars and shelters into a nightmare landscape. Entire neighborhoods had ceased to exist. Fires still burned everywhere, and the fire brigades could do little but let them burn out naturally. The injured overwhelmed the hospitals. The dead were too numerous to bury quickly, so temporary morgues were established in schools and churches. Nazi officials arrived to assess the damage and were stunned by what they found. This level of destruction from a single raid was unprecedented. If the British could do this to Cologne, they could do it to any German city. The 1,000-bomber raid had achieved its psychological objective. It had demonstrated that nowhere in Germany was safe, but it had also hardened German resolve. Rather than destroying morale, the raid created anger and determination to fight on. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels visited Cologne 2 days later and gave speeches about German resilience and revenge. The 1,000-bomber raid became a rallying point for the Nazi regime, proof that the Allies were war criminals targeting civilians. The debate about the morality and effectiveness of area bombing would continue throughout the war and long after. Did it shorten the conflict? Did it save lives by destroying Germany's war-making capacity? Or was it simply mass murder dressed up in military necessity? For the air crews of Bomber Command, these questions were secondary to survival. They would fly again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night until the war ended or they died. The 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne was just the beginning of a strategic bombing campaign that would kill hundreds of thousands of civilians on both sides and leave dozens of German cities in ruins. Robbie Harrison flew 47 more missions before war's end. He survived, though many of his friends did not. After the war, he never spoke about what he had done, never attended squadron reunions, never displayed his medals. He had done his duty, but he carried the weight of it for the rest of his life. Greta Hoffmann rebuilt her life in the ruins of Cologne. She married, had children, and watched the city slowly rise from its ashes. She never blamed the British bomber crews for what happened that night. She blamed the war, the madness that had consumed Europe, the leaders on all sides who had valued ideology over human life. Decades later, when Cologne Cathedral had been restored and the city rebuilt, Greta stood in the square where she had taken refuge that terrible night. Tourists walked past, unaware of the history beneath their feet, the fires that had raged here, the lives lost. She thought about the young British airmen who had flown over her city, boys really, following orders, scared and brave in equal measure. The war had made enemies of people who had no personal animosity toward each other. It had forced ordinary people to do extraordinary things, both heroic and terrible. And it had left scars on cities, on people, on history itself. that would never fully heal. The 1,000 bombers that darkened the German sky on May 30th, 1942, changed warfare forever. They proved that strategic bombing could devastate a city in a single night. They demonstrated that technology had made war more terrible than ever before, and they showed that in modern conflict there were no safe places, no sanctuaries, no immunity for anyone. That was the legacy of Operation Millennium, not just the destruction of Cologne, but the knowledge that war had entered a new era, one where entire cities could be erased from the sky, where civilians were no longer bystanders but targets, where the distinction between soldier and non-combatant had been blurred beyond recognition. The bombers eventually returned to their bases, their crews climbed out exhausted, and life continued. But nothing was ever quite the same after the night when 1,000 bombers darkened the German sky and rewrote the rules of warfare forever. In the days following Operation Millennium, reconnaissance aircraft flew over Cologne to photograph the damage. The images shocked even the men who had planned the raid. Nearly 600 acres of the city centre had been devastated. Over 3,300 non-residential buildings destroyed, including hospitals, schools, churches, and historic landmarks. 13,000 homes obliterated, leaving 45,000 people homeless. Between 135,000 and 150,000 residents, more than 20% of the city's population, had fled Cologne in the days following the attack. The official German death toll was 469 civilians, though many believed the real number was higher, bodies buried in rubble that wouldn't be cleared for months. Over 5,000 people had been injured. For a single night's work, it was the most destructive air raid in history to that point. But Operation Millennium had proven something else as well. The concept worked. The bomber stream, concentrating a massive force over one target in a short time window, had overwhelmed German defences. The Luftwaffe's night fighters, though they had shot down several aircraft, had been unable to prevent the raid. The flak batteries had been firing continuously, but couldn't engage enough targets simultaneously. The sheer concentration of bombers had succeeded where smaller raids had failed. For RAF Bomber Command and Air Marshal Harris, the 1,000-bomber raid was vindication. It proved that strategic bombing could devastate German cities, and demonstrated that Bomber Command deserved the resources and aircraft it was receiving. The raid generated enormous publicity in Britain and around the world. Newspapers ran headlines celebrating the attack. Churchill praised the crew's courage and determination. But for the men who had flown the mission, the celebration felt hollow. In the week following the Cologne raid, Robbie Harrison watched as 3 more 1,000-bomber raids were attempted, against Essen and Bremen, with diminishing returns. The element of surprise was gone. The Germans had adapted their defences, and the strain of scraping together 1,000 aircraft for each raid was unsustainable. By mid-June, Bomber Command had returned to more conventional operations. Smaller raids, more frequent attacks, gradually building up the heavy bomber force that would eventually allow for large-scale operations without needing to use training aircraft and inexperienced crews. Robbie flew throughout that summer and fall, watching as new crews arrived and old crews disappeared. Some completed their tours of 30 operations and were rotated out. Others were shot down, their names added to the growing list of casualties. The mathematics were brutal. Statistically, a bomber crew had less than a 50% chance of surviving a full tour. In September 1942, Robbie's luck ran out. During a raid on Bremen, S for Sugar took heavy damage from flak and fighters. They limped back across the North Sea with 2 engines out and the hydraulic system destroyed. Robbie managed to crash land at the first airfield they reached, wheels up, sliding down the runway in a shower of sparks. The aircraft was a write-off, but miraculously, all 7 crew members survived with only minor injuries. It was their 42nd mission together. They had beaten the odds. Robbie was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and, to his relief, was taken off flying duties and assigned to an instructor position, training new pilots. He would spend the rest of the war teaching others to fly, watching young men barely out of school climb into bombers and head off to Germany, some never to return. Tommy Fletcher wasn't as fortunate. He completed his tour with Robbie, but volunteered for a second tour when his first ended. He was killed over Hamburg in July 1943 during Operation Gomorrah, another massive raid that created a firestorm that killed over 40,000 people in a single night. He was 21 years old. David Price survived the war and became a mathematics teacher. Jack Morrison died in 1944 when his new bomber was shot down over Berlin. Willie Banks made it through but never recovered from his wounds, dying in 1946 from complications. Peter Walsh and Colin Drake both survived and, like Robbie, tried to build normal lives after the war ended. In Cologne, Greta Hoffmann and her family survived the immediate aftermath of the raid, but their lives were forever changed. Their apartment building was gone. Her father's business was destroyed. The city they had known no longer existed. Over the next 3 years, Cologne would be bombed 261 more times. By war's end, 90% of the city centre would be completely destroyed. Over 20,000 civilians would be killed in the bombing campaign. The beautiful medieval city on the Rhine, with its 1,000-year history, was reduced to rubble. Greta worked as a volunteer nurse throughout the war, helping care for the wounded and sick. She saw horrors that no 18-year-old should witness. Her brother Hans was killed in 1944, age 11, during another air raid when he was separated from the family. The grief nearly destroyed her mother. When the Americans finally captured Cologne in March 1945, Greta was among the survivors who emerged from the ruins. The city was unrecognizable. Street after street of destroyed buildings, mountains of rubble. The famous Hohenzollern Bridge collapsed into the Rhine. Only the cathedral still stood, its twin spires miraculously intact despite everything falling around them. The rebuilding of Cologne took decades. Greta married an American soldier in 1947, a medic who had treated wounded German civilians after the city's capture. They stayed in Germany, helping with reconstruction efforts. She had 3 children, and, against all odds, found happiness amid the ruins. In 1962, 20 years after Operation Millennium, a British veterans group organised a reunion in Cologne for RAF bomber crews who had participated in the raids. It was a controversial decision. Many Germans were still angry about the bombing, still mourning loved ones lost. But the city government approved, hoping it would promote reconciliation. Robbie Harrison attended, now 42 years old, married with children, working as a commercial airline pilot. He walked through the rebuilt city centre, marvelling at how Cologne had risen from the ashes. New buildings stood where burned-out ruins had been. The cathedral had been restored. Life had returned to the streets. At a reception hosted by the city, Robbie found himself standing next to an older German woman who spoke excellent English. They made small talk, 2 strangers at an awkward event, until she asked him which raid he had flown in. "The first one," Robbie said quietly. "May 30th, 1942. The 1,000-bomber raid." The woman was silent for a long moment. "I was here that night," she finally said. "I was 18. My family and I took shelter in a cellar while the city burned around us. We barely escaped alive." Robbie felt his throat tighten. "I'm sorry. We didn't... He struggled to find words. "We were following orders. We were trying to win the war, but that doesn't excuse the suffering we caused." The woman, Greta, though they hadn't yet exchanged names, looked at him with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. "I used to hate you," she said simply. "All of you. The bombers, the crews, the men who destroyed my city and killed my brother. I carried that hate for years." "You have every right to hate us." "Yes, but hate is exhausting." She gestured around the room at the mix of former RAF crews and German civilians, awkwardly attempting conversation. "This is better. Not forgiveness, perhaps. Not yet. But acknowledgement. Understanding. You were soldiers, following orders. We were civilians, caught in a war we didn't start. Both of us were victims of something larger than ourselves." They talked for over an hour, sharing their experiences from that night and the years that followed. When they finally parted, they shook hands, a simple gesture that somehow meant everything. Robbie returned to England, changed by the encounter. For 20 years he had carried guilt about the bombing campaign, about the civilians who had died because of bombs he had helped deliver. Meeting Greta hadn't absolved that guilt, but it had contextualized it, made it bearable. He began speaking at schools and universities about his wartime experiences, not glorifying what he had done, but trying to convey the complexity of it. Yes, he had fought for a just cause against Nazi tyranny. Yes, the bombing campaign had contributed to Germany's defeat and the end of the war. But yes, it had also killed tens of thousands of innocent civilians and caused immeasurable suffering. Both things could be true simultaneously. War was not clean or simple. Victory came at terrible costs, and those costs were paid not just by soldiers, but by civilians on all sides. In 1985, Robbie returned to Cologne one final time, now 65 years old and in declining health. Greta, now 61, met him at the cathedral. They stood together looking up at the soaring Gothic spires that had survived when everything around them had burned. "I've been thinking about that night," Robbie said. 43 years ago, 1,000 bombers over this city. We thought we were changing the course of the war, that our sacrifice and your suffering would shorten the conflict and save lives in the long run." "Did it?" Greta asked. "Did the bombing campaign shorten the war?" "I don't know. Historians still debate it. Some say yes, that destroying German industry and disrupting transportation networks weakened the Nazi war machine. Others say no, that it only hardened German resistance and diverted resources that could have been used more effectively elsewhere." He paused. "What I know is that 469 people died in Cologne that night. Thousands more in the raids that followed, tens of thousands across Germany. And I helped make it happen." "And yet you're not a monster," Greta said gently. "You were a young man doing what your country asked of you, just as German soldiers were young men doing what their country asked. The real criminals were the leaders who started the war, who made it necessary for good men to do terrible things." They stood in silence, two elderly survivors of humanity's darkest conflict, trying to make peace with their shared history. Robbie Harrison died in 1989, just before the Berlin Wall fell. In his will, he left money to a German-British friendship foundation dedicated to youth education and reconciliation. His obituary in the Times mentioned his service with Bomber Command, but focused more on his post-war work promoting understanding between former enemies. Greta Hoffmann lived until 2003, age 79, long enough to see the European Union expand and Germany reunified. She spent her final years giving talks to German schoolchildren about the war, about the importance of preventing such conflicts in the future, about the dangers of nationalism and hatred. The 1,000-bomber raid on Cologne became a symbol of different things to different people. For the RAF, it was proof that strategic bombing could work, that concentrated force could overwhelm defences and devastate targets. For the Germans, it was evidence of Allied brutality, of total war extended to civilian populations. For historians, it became a focal point in the ongoing debate about the morality and effectiveness of area bombing. But for the people who lived through it, the crews who flew over the burning city, and the civilians who huddled in cellars while bombs fell, it was simply war in its most terrible form. Not glorious or noble, but brutal and traumatic, leaving scars that never fully healed. The cathedral still stands in Cologne today, restored to its Gothic glory, a UNESCO World Heritage Site visited by millions. The city rebuilt around it is modern and prosperous, part of a peaceful, united Europe that would have seemed impossible to imagine in 1942. In the cathedral, there's a small plaque commemorating the victims of the bombing campaign. It doesn't assign blame or make political statements. It simply lists names and asks visitors to remember. On May 30th each year, a small ceremony is held. Attendance has dwindled as the years pass, and the generation that lived through the war dies off. Soon there will be no one left who remembers that night when the sky darkened with 1,000 bombers, and a city learned what modern war truly meant. But the lessons remain, carved not in stone, but in collective memory. That war destroys not just buildings, but lives, families, futures. That even just causes require terrible sacrifices. That the line between heroism and atrocity is sometimes distressingly thin. That the only real victors in war are those who find ways to prevent it. The 1,000 bombers that darkened the German sky on May 30th, 1942, changed warfare forever. They demonstrated that air power could devastate cities in a single night. They showed that there were no safe places in modern conflict, no immunity for civilian populations. But perhaps more importantly, they showed the world where that path led, to cities in ruins, to tens of thousands dead, to generations traumatized, to a cycle of destruction that could only end in mutual devastation. In the end, the real legacy of Operation Millennium wasn't the destruction of Cologne or the vindication of strategic bombing theory. It was the lesson, learned slowly and painfully over decades, that winning wars by destroying cities kills not just the enemy, but something essential in ourselves. Robbie Harrison and Greta Hoffman, separated by nationality and circumstance, united by their shared experience of that terrible night, understood this in ways that politicians and historians never could. They had lived through the fire and emerged not as enemies, but as witnesses to humanity's capacity for both destruction and healing. Their story, and the stories of thousands like them, remind us that history is not made by nations or ideologies, but by individual human beings trying to survive, trying to do right, trying to find meaning in circumstances beyond their control. The bombers are long gone, scrapped or preserved in museums. The crews who flew them are nearly all dead. The city they destroyed has been rebuilt. But the memory remains, a warning from the past to the future, that the darkening of the sky with instruments of war is something that must never become normal, never become acceptable, never become anything but the tragedy it truly is. That is the final lesson of the day when 1,000 bombers darkened the German sky. Not that war can be won through overwhelming force, but that the cost of such victories is measured in human lives and human souls, and that price is always too high.